What's up everyone, Daniel Yuck here. Thank you all for tuning in today, I appreciate you. Within this video, I would like to share with you all how I go about shading a rose. For this demonstration, I am going to be demonstrating on paper using a ballpoint cartridge pen here. Links will be in the description below for the gear that I am using. But for this demonstration, that is the setup that I'm going to be utilizing. And I'm going to go ahead and touch base on some fundamentals and my logic, thought process, and approach throughout this video. So by the end of this video, you will be more acquainted with how to go about or approach shading a rose on your end. Should you have any questions at all about anything that you see or hear throughout this video, I'm going to highly encourage you to drop a comment down below, and I'm going to do my absolute best to assist you in the best possible direction. With that being said, let's dive straight on into this. One of the first things that I establish when it comes to shading is my expectations. What am I wanting out of my shading? So this is the first important thing that I go through as an artist. How do I want my shading to look? What am I capable of doing? So for me personally, I feel it's a great place to start to figure out your expectations, figure out the types of shadings that you want to do on your end. Since I am using a ballpoint pen tattoo cartridge setup, I'm going to be going for a stipple-like approach as if I would tattooing with a 3-round liner. So I'm going to be going for a stipple texture type of look while still trying to keep a certain smoothness to my shading. So that's the overall goal. That is in terms of how I want it to look. But not only that, I'm also going to be focusing on the shading placement. Shading placement is going to be crucial for me. So I have to combine the placement with the technical approach of making sure I'm applying smooth shading to begin with. Now that I'm understanding my expectations from my shading and I'm understanding my setup, from here I'm going to start picking out the techniques that I'm going to be using to apply the shading. So according to my setup, since it is a ballpoint cartridge pen, I'm going to be using pendulum and whip style shading for this specific rose right here. Maybe even the occasional dots in some tighter areas. I'm also going to be touching base on when I utilize these techniques and why I use them as well. So I highly encourage you to stick around until the end of the video so you can really absorb the information that I'm trying to relay here in its entirety. I'm also going to be running at a lower voltage range, anywhere from 5 to 6. Feel free to experiment with what feels right for you on your end. You're kind of going to want to match your hand speed to that, in which I'm also going to touch base on here in this video. In order to get smooth shading, we're gonna want to match that hand speed and voltage. So if you're not familiar with hand speed and voltage, I also have a full in-depth review on that. So don't overlook that little aspect right there. We're gonna want to be familiar with matching our hand speed and voltage. So I would recommend to invest into some fake skin. Links will be in the description below, and get familiar with good hand speeds and voltages for you on your end. How I look at shading is a little like this. So for the hand speed and voltage, for me, that's going to determine how smooth the shading is going to come out. And depending on the pressure that we are using is going to determine how darker some areas are going to be. Now keep in mind, this is going to be when it comes to shading with a ballpoint pen. When it's in terms of tattooing, it is going to vary a little bit. However, I will touch base on that in another video. Moving front now, so for this rose right here, what I am doing is I am figuring out and I'm laying down where I want the darker areas to be. So essentially, I'm placing in the darker areas first. The darker areas are my point of interest when I begin shading, and that's going to be for any design. That could apply to any design that I'm doing, not just this rose. Where I am at right now is I am more familiar with my setup and expectations. I'm more familiar with the technical approach that I'm going to be taking. I'm familiar with the hand speed and voltage that I'm going to be using, and now I'm identifying the darker parts that I'm going to start with so that I can start building up this rose. For me personally, since I am shading on paper, in terms of where I begin, it's neither really here or there, as I don't have a stencil to lose like I do in tattooing. So for this, I kind of just kept it traditional, the way I would approach it if I were tattooing, and I began to work from the bottom portion that I felt comfortable with and kind of just worked my way on up. However, keep in mind, if you're working on paper and you're practicing the same way that I am here, you can start at the beginning of the rose, which is not wrong, to each their own. Before me, I kind of just kept it traditional, the same way that I would as if I am tattooing. For this demonstration, I'm using a Masu ink needle cartridge. I'm using sublimation paper, and I believe, if I'm correct, I'm using the Phantom tattoo machine for this rose right here. And again, I'm going to leave links for you in the description below for all of this. Before I continue any further, one thing that I want to point out is that you can take the rule of thumb that I am trying to demonstrate here in this video and apply it to just a simple ballpoint pen and move the pen back and forth to go ahead and apply the rules of thumb that I'm demonstrating here in this video. So any setup that you have on your end will work. This can be without a tattoo machine, as I'm using a tattoo machine in this video right here. Again, this can be done simply by hand. Back to this rose right here. What I am doing right now is I'm essentially identifying my darker areas. So I do have a reference that I am looking at, and I am recognizing the darker points within the reference, and I'm basically implementing what I visually see onto this tattoo right here. Now keep in mind, these lines shouldn't be apparent when I am done. I just simply am kind of setting the boundary in which I'm not going to go outside of with these lines, and then I'm going to start implementing a shade here, as you can see. So I'm not going to be utilizing any lines within this tattoo right here. Once I've set the boundaries in which I'm comfortable with and I'm not going to go outside of, once I basically have the area that I'm going to begin to darken up, I'm going to go ahead and begin to technically do that. So you can see I'm only using the very tips of this pen cartridge right here, and you can see I'm getting a nice little shade there going on. And again, I'm just running at a super low voltage, and I'm just matching my hand speed to get a smooth, consistent result, as we see here. Some may see this exercise here as redundant or not effective, but for me personally, the education that I do gain for shading placement and technical approaches such as pressure and hand speed and voltage, I'm able to actually learn with this sort of tool, and it does translate over onto my tattoos in my tattooing. So for me personally, from my experience, just being able to practice shading placement on paper has in fact made me a better tattoo artist. This may vary from person to person, to each their own. For this part of the rose right here, you can see that I'm using different approaches and different applications. Right here I was cross hatching, and right here I'm using simple whips. And keep in mind, the pressure that I'm applying is next to none. I'm just letting the very tip of that ballpoint pen do the work for me. However, the idea is that I'm identifying where I want the darker points, and I am using my technical abilities to go ahead and make that happen. When it comes to shading with a pencil or a ballpoint pen, one thing that I've noticed is the harder that I press, the more pronounced the color is. So with that little rule right there, I'm able to determine and get different results, such as some areas I can do lighter by simply utilizing a little bit of pressure. Some areas I can go really dark by adding a little bit more pressure. So this is just one rule of thumb that I utilize, and it's a simple rule, but it is highly effective when applied in the correct places. So that is one thing that I am constantly aware of, especially when it comes to shading with a ballpoint pen and even a pencil. I'm always aware of the pressure that I am using for whatever part I am currently working on. If I apply a little bit too much pressure, sometimes and oftentimes that little stroke of extra pressure is going to show up darker than the areas around it. Therefore, sometimes it may force you to go darker in a certain area that you didn't want to go darker in. So one thing that I would highly recommend to work on and continuously be mindful of is how hard you are pressing down and how much pressure you're really applying to that tip when you're shading. One very important thing that I want to point out is that shading is a world of its own. So if you're having trouble shading, and if you think that shading is impossible to achieve, or overall just very discouraged when it comes to shading and maybe even afraid of it, I was there too, and trust me, if you take the time to kind of start at the bottom, learn the basics, and figure out a good practicing point, you're going to be able to achieve shading that you didn't think you can. For me personally, I'm very happy with the results that we achieve right here in this rose. By the end of the video, you will see the results, so please stick around for that. But again, if you're feeling discouraged with your current shading journey, I highly encourage you just to take a step back, go back to some floral tattoos, go to something more easy and figure out shading on there. Maybe even get the same design and shade it 5 times. You're going to be able to see your progression. You're going to be able to see your thought process and even technical approach gradually change. So I encourage you to just go through the motions, make the mistakes, so that way tomorrow when you do tattoo again, it's going to start clicking. You have to just stick with it, be patient with the process and learn a technical approach, learn comfortability, get comfortable with your setup. Everything that I'm mentioning here in the video, all of this stuff has to align so that way we could achieve good results. If you take a look here at my technical approach, you're going to notice that I am layering certain areas and I'm going over areas in one direction, and I'm getting the smoothest look that I can possibly achieve by matching my hand speed and voltage, and then I'm going back over it in a different direction. This is also known as cross hatching, and this is a technique that I use throughout this entire tattoo right here, and it's probably a technique that I'm going to use almost on every single tattoo. So that's one thing that you may want to get comfortable with, is after you've gotten comfortable with getting smooth shading, then you're going to want to try to go ahead and start overlapping them in a crosshatch type of direction. Let's also keep in mind that I am shading on paper here using a ballpoint pen, so I'm being very delicate, and even throughout this process you're going to see that I do get some paper chips from time to time. When it comes to tattooing human skin, obviously some important variables would definitely have to have changed and been aligned in correspondence to human skin. But what will stay the same for me is where I am placing the darker points. So again, I really can't also exhaust the fact that this sort of exercise, even if you're not doing this in a tattoo style format like this, even if you're just shading with a ballpoint pen, figuring out shading placement and being able to practice like this on paper is definitely going to be able to translate over into the tattoo world. Since we are using paper and a pen, I'm not going to get into any gray wash or anything like that, as that is more tattoo related. So for this video, what I am working with to compensate for a gray wash that I would have been using in tattooing is I am using pressure. So again, the areas that I want darker, I'm applying just a bit more pressure so that way I can get more of the true color of this pen that I am using. And this is a black cartridge that I am using, so the darkest point is obviously going to be black. So the more pressure that I'm putting, I'm getting closer to that black point. So I'm just identifying the areas that I want darker, and I'm actually taking my time, and more importantly, I'm trusting the process, because there is certain moments when I am building up this artwork right here where I'm not happy with it. It kind of looks choppy to me. However, if you trust your abilities, you trust the process, you're going to reach points where you're really happy, and you're going to go ahead and move on to the next part. You'll notice right here in this time lapse, the beginning of this shaded part that I'm working on does look choppy. However, I definitely trust the process. I trust when I need to use certain technical approaches, and I just trust my choice making ability. And it's also a good exercise to practice just that. Being able to make the correct choices for the design at hand is crucial to the result and outcome of our tattoos, and I would say even crucial to the quality. Choice making and good choice making is a talent, I feel, especially within the tattoo world. So for me, again, I'm just identifying the darker areas, and I'm just kind of layering in the areas where I'm not going to go outside of, and I'm establishing the points of shading that I want to implement shading on this rose right here. I feel like this is a good time to talk about the pendulum motion, or the brush-like pendulum motions that I'm using on this rose right here. So when it comes down to picking out the technical approach that I need, it really comes down to the design. So when I'm needing to cover bigger areas that don't necessarily have a definite starting point, or I guess starting point in terms of a darker point to a lighter point, I'm gonna use a pendulum motion to go ahead and cover a bigger area. And again, I'm just gonna go ahead and confirm that whenever a part of a design doesn't have, let's say, a darker starting point and an ending point, it rather has a more space to kind of shade in, I'm going to use a pendulum motion to kind of cover larger areas. And I'm going to be using whip motions when I want to kind of establish a darker point of boundary. So I'll use simple whip motions, placing down the darkest dot at the beginning and then whipping out. So what this is doing is it's allowing me to have a boundary in which I'm not going to go past, and now I know that this is where I want the darkest point to be. I personally think that this goes back to, again, the choice making abilities. You're going to see on certain parts, I'm even combining the pendulum with a whip sort of motion to achieve a certain effect. As you can see on this pedal right there in the middle, there has a little whip there, and it has some negative space going into the middle part of that rose right there, that darker point. So again, if you're combining both of them and utilizing them in a creative way, you're able to achieve some pretty cool results, I feel. But again, knowing when to use whip motions and knowing when to use pendulum brush like motions and knowing when to apply more pressure is going to be everything. And all of these choices that we are making, keep in mind, are going to determine the final read of the tattoo or the design that we are doing, and it's going to determine the final results, which is why I feel being able to make good calculated artistic choices along the way of us tattooing is a big factor in the quality of our work. This is a lot of information to consume in one go. So if you're going to watch the entire video, I would recommend to watch it in its entirety. Take what you can right now and then leave what you don't find interesting, and then I would recommend to come back in a week and then watch it again, and then I would recommend to repeat this process, and I can guarantee you that you're going to see changes within your shading and you're going to see progression within the work that you were currently doing. So again, just stick around, watch the entire video, and try to take what you want, leave what you don't. Try not to overwhelm yourself as well along the way. Now, I'm going to highly encourage you, if you have any questions at all, please drop them in the comment section down below. I'm going to do my absolute best to assist you in the best possible direction. Another aspect of shading that I kind of want to get into here is choppiness of shading. Now, for me, when I first started shading, one thing that I was terrified of, along with shading placement, was the final look of my shading, how it read when others looked at it. Was my shading choppy? Was it smooth? Did I go too dark in some areas? How was it applied? So with all of these moving pieces that we have to align to get good shading, it terrified me when I first started. The idea of shading was something that I wanted to, in fact, just stay away from completely. I wanted to do tattoos that only involve line work and strictly line work, and I wanted to do just line work because how terrified I was of shading. Fast forward till today, I'm very grateful that I truly admire and I enjoy the process of shading. I enjoy picking out where I want my darker spots to be, where I want my lighter points. I enjoy the process of applying smooth shading. There's something that has this great sense of satisfaction when I'm applying shading and it comes out as smooth as I envisioned it. When I'm able to achieve those goals, it almost feels like I'm making a three-point shot on a basketball court. It has a great sense of accomplishment for me to be able to achieve smooth results. You're going to notice right here on this specific part, things do get choppy. However, and even when I'm doing this, I acknowledge that it's choppy. So therefore, I'm able to correct the parts that I don't like. And again, I do feel like that is just a part of the process. If we trust in our technical abilities to apply good shading, if we have a good plan in terms of where we want our darker points and lighter points to be, then we should be able to kind of make those shots in correspondence to our skill sets. So for me, I identify the darker areas right here, and I am using the technical approach to apply the shading in a manner that I see fit for this rose right here. Let's take a moment now and let's talk about smooth and choppy shading. Now, for me personally, this is how I look at these aspects right here. When it comes to smooth and choppy shading, it's probably because something is either aligned for smooth shading, and for choppy shading, things may be unaligned. So allow me to touch base on this aspect more here. Earlier in the video, I was talking about some fundamental rules that I follow, and these rules, just to refresh our memory, are the shading expectations, what I wanted out of my shading, being comfortable with my gear. I was also mentioning hand speed and voltage, and I was also mentioning being able to acknowledge the darker areas and the lighter areas within my design and how I'm going to achieve certain shadings in certain areas. So these are some things that I've been going over in this video. Now keep in mind, mind, all of these essentially, and this is how I see it, keep in mind that as well. All of these variables have to line up and be in correspondence to one another, meaning they have to be able to work well together in order for us to achieve a smooth shading result. Let me touch base on the idea of aligning these variables. So if we are running a hand speed faster than we are running a voltage, then the needle isn't going to be hitting enough into the skin, so therefore the shading is going to look choppy. Now let's say if we are running at too high of a speed and we aren't able to move our hand fast enough to compensate for the faster speed, we may go too dark too quick. Please keep in mind that those are just a couple of variables that were unaligned, which was going to reflect negatively within the shading itself. So knowing the basics, knowing the fundamentals, being comfortable and knowing what hand speed and voltage you work at, again, I can't exhaust it enough that all of these have to be aligned to be able to accomplish the shading that we are setting out to accomplish. Allow me to paint another scenario for you here that can go wrong when doing a tattoo. So basically, when we are approaching a tattoo, we want to be able to map it out. Let's just say, for example, I was taking on a design where I wasn't sure where to place darker points. So let's just focus on the variable of acknowledging where I want my darker spots to be. Let's just say if I was winging it and I was just kind of, a dark spot should go here, another dark spot should go here, another dark spot should go here. I can't possibly expect for this sort of approach to just sit well with the eye of the beholder, as there's no logical premise as to why I'm placing dark in these certain areas. Was there a reference? Am I just using my imagination? So you can kind of get the idea behind that. If I'm just kind of guessing sporadically where darker spots should be with no logical reference or meaning behind that action, then we can't possibly expect quality results. And keep in mind, that's just a one variable of shading that has to be aligned as well, is being able to acknowledge where the darker points and lighter points should be. So the way that I look at it is we have to combine the proper expectations with our technical abilities. We have to combine the proper choice making of when to use whips and pendulums with the correct hand speed and voltage, and also combining the aspect of knowing where we want our darker and lighter spots to be. So when we align all of these, I do feel like that is a step into the right direction, because keep in mind, we could kind of make a mistake along the way, apply a little bit more pressure than we anticipated, which is going to force us to ultimately go a little bit darker in certain areas. So this is another reason why shading shouldn't be something that discourages us, but rather something that we work up into over the course of some time, especially if we're just starting out getting into shading. One thing that you're going to notice throughout this entire rose right here is that it's almost going to look like I'm not doing anything when I am moving back and forth in certain areas. For me personally, the way that I like to approach shading is to build it up. So you can see right here, I am using just a very light amount of pressure, so that way I can get the base layer of the shading, and I can kind of gradually build up from there. For me personally, I would rather layer and go dark slower than kind of go straight into it and go too dark too quickly in areas that shouldn't be that dark. One thing that I'm definitely going to be taking with me into tattooing is in terms of how I look at the points of dark to light. Where I want my darker shading is almost the same way that I'm going to look at it when I tattoo. What's really going to change is the equipment that I am using and the way that the shading is going to be applied, because I'm going to be using tattoo needles and ink as well, which is different from a ballpoint pen. One technique that I use very often to start achieving that smooth shaded look is cross hatching. So I like to cross hatch using different pressures, so I'm always aware of where I want the darker point to be, and when I am cross hatching, I'm always aware of which direction as well I am cross hatching in, as I do feel like that plays an important role on how the shading reads. I think, in my opinion, What people see when they see smooth, soft, clean shading is they're really seeing the time and effort that the artist took to apply the shading in a manner that reads that way. Because again, if we are aligning all of these fundamentals, we are going to be getting some nice, clean, smooth shading. Some shading may be just clean and smooth. They may have used a gray wash. Some other shadings may be clean, smooth with like a dot pepper texture. You can kind of get the idea. It really all just depends on the artist and design at hand, to each their own. And when it's a poorly done shading job, obviously what we are going to see is the choppiness from the improper hand speed and voltage, or we're going to see the lack of planning through the blotchiness. Maybe they went too dark. Maybe some areas don't make sense as to why some areas are more darker than others. There's no dimension or depth. It kind of looks flat. You can kind of get the idea. So there is a lot of things that can go wrong, and a lot of these things are the things that scared me tremendously when I first started shading. For me personally, how I look at shading is a systematic type of art, meaning shading isn't something that's for the supernatural or anything like that. If we learn the fundamentals and the basics in shading, we can start kind of stepping up those stones and climbing up the ladder and seeing and understanding shading in ways that we didn't know that we could, so to speak. That's why I say shading is a world of its own, because we can't have one variable without the other. We can't be comfortable with the gear that we are using and not have been able to match our hand speed with the voltage. We can't be comfortable with hand speed and voltage, but yet we can't have our plan sorted before the tattoo. So again, we can't have one variable without the other. We have to know how to plan out the tattoos. We have to know which areas go darker over others. We have to know which way to whip our machine. We have to know how to choose which technique we need to apply. We have to know how dark we want to go. We have to know how deep we need to go in certain areas. So you can kind of get the idea of what I'm trying to say. Knowing these basic fundamentals is going to be crucial in your choice making when it comes to shading. But not only choice making, it's going to be crucial for the overall confidence and performance that you are going to be doing within your tattoos. Please note that even though I am mentioning tattoos, this is also applying to paper. As you see, for this demonstration, I am performing these fundamentals on paper. So I just want to point that out as well. The same thing is going to translate over to the tattoo world. For those who do want to see that video, be sure to stick around, hit that subscribe button, as I am going to make a full in-depth video of me doing this in a tattoo form. Back to the paper here. Now, when I am doing this, as you see, I'm starting off with the boundaries and I'm laying a very, very light layer of the shading while pinpointing where I need the darker areas to be. And I'm doing my best to stick with the reference design that I chose to go ahead and apply for this tattoo right here. I do feel like I've covered most of the important aspects when it comes to my logic and my thought process when I'm applying shading. There is one more very important variable that I do want to go over before I go ahead and conclude this video. Another thing that I want to touch base on is the reference material. Now, there was once upon a time where I would simply have a design but no reference material. There wasn't anything that would allow me to reference any sort of shading, and this only typically comes to tattoos that required shading. There was never really any good references that I had to kind of help me and direct me and let me know, hey, this should be a little darker, this should be a little lighter. So where I am getting at with this story, and the moral of this story, is if you don't put much effort and or thought into your reference material at this moment, I'm going to highly encourage you to do so. I would recommend and encourage to take a bit more time to get some very good reference material and a comfortable setup, so that way when you are in action and you're ready to go, you have everything in a comfortable manner, so that way your workflow can be smooth and as seamless as you can possibly get it on your end. So be sure to get some good quality reference material. Get something that you can reference as you are doing the shading, as you are applying it. So that way, I guess for me, how I look at a reference is I'm looking at the reference and it's sort of my guide to let me know where darker points should be and where lighter points should be. It's basically a kind of a foundation that I utilize to go ahead and keep me in the right direction, because the last thing that I would want to do is go too dark in certain areas and or apply shading in certain areas where there shouldn't have been shading. So again, back to that quality reference material, make sure that the reference material that you are using on your end is of quality and that you did put some time into it to make sure that it is referenceable upon tattooing or upon applying your shading. Another thing that I feel is very important to touch base on is the reference here is just that. It is essentially, as I stated, the foundation. It's not the cement concrete way that the tattoo is going to be. So basically, when I'm looking at the reference, I do like to contribute my artistic input in the reference. So sometimes I like to leave a little bit of negative space where the reference didn't say that, just because on skin I like the way that it reads with some skin showing through. And again, that's just the artistic touch. However, when I am looking at the reference, it's rare that I'm ever trying to follow it to the T. What I pay attention to the absolute most when I look at references is where the lighter and darker values are at. And then from there, I use my artistic input to figure out how I'm going to go about applying those lighter and darker values. I will step outside of what the reference displays to me when I feel artistically there is a far better approach that I could take. And this is not often, this isn't something that I reach for. If this occurs within the design naturally to me, if something stands out that I'm like, I think it'll look better on skin this way versus what the reference reads, I'm going to use my artistic decision and I'm going to make the choice to follow that gut feeling of mine and go with the way that I think it will look better. The logic is, if I have to put too much thought into this specific change versus what the reference is displaying, I probably shouldn't do it. I know naturally that I would prefer my way versus the reference. Again, when it comes naturally to me and I didn't have to overthink it, the moment that I have to, like, again, kind of second guess this specific idea because I want to experiment, is the moment I'm going to try to stick with the reference as close as I can possibly get it, just because the reference is going to read a lot better than an idea that I may have. So for me personally, having good quality reference material allows me to go ahead and have better shading placement, which does impact the quality and readability of my final product. So for the remainder of this video, and actually throughout the entire process of this rose, you're going to notice that I'm gradually building up these layers right here. And I essentially begin by identifying where I want the darker points to be. And then I will start implementing the darker shadings using the technical approaches that I know. Sometimes I'll use a whip shade, sometimes I'll use a pendulum brush like motion. And it did vary throughout the entire tattoo. So making the choices throughout the way was a bit of a task as well to figure out which ones were appropriate for times. After a while though, once we practice on this aspect, if you're nervous about it, it does become natural. I recommend just to kind of stick with it and keep working on it. The technical side of shading in terms of how to get smooth shading comes with practice. So the only thing that we can do is essentially get a paper and practice shading. However, what I would recommend to focus on today is learning to read your reference material. So wherever the reference has the darker points, follow those darker points, and wherever the lighter points are, follow those lighter points. Wherever there is empty space in the reference, leave it empty. So what I'm saying is, I would recommend focusing on being able to read your reference material, but not only that, apply the tattoo the way the reference is displaying. Try not to deviate too much from the reference that you all chose. When it comes to shading in general, it's typically going to take time to develop good shading that we are happy with. So if it's a technical issue that we are dealing with shading, the only thing that I can recommend is to just practice and develop the core fundamentals and get really comfortable with certain techniques within shading. Now, when it comes to the other aspect of quality reference material, that's something more immediate that we can practice, as again, the technical side is something that we have to develop into. We have to develop into certain technical abilities. So for me, what I would recommend, something that's a bit more immediate, is to focus on picking out good quality reference material. And then after you've done that, go ahead and take it a step further and try to follow the reference that you picked out as best as you can. Wherever the reference says it's darker, go ahead and apply the shading there, and you kind of get the idea there. So that is, I feel, something that's more immediate that we as artists can do today. At the end of this video, you will be able to see the finished results. But there you all have it. That pretty much sums up shading in multiple fronts here. Now, I hope that I can help you in some sort of direction. If you have any questions at all, I'm going to encourage you yet again to drop a comment down below. I'm going to do my absolute best to assist you in the best possible direction. I also want to encourage you all to follow me on social medias. I also have social medias all under the same name as this YouTube channel. I would truly appreciate the support on there as well. I would also appreciate it if you all would follow my ladies' YouTube channels at Lily Yuck and Lila Yuck. I will leave links for you all in the description below. We would truly appreciate the support. I would like to thank you all for tuning in, and I hope you all have a great day.